There is no doubt in my mind that Bruce is innocent. He did not commit this crime, and the evidence shows it.
Because of the unique circumstances and because of the lost evidence, it didn't necessarily solve the mystery.
Bruce maintained his innocence the entire time.
This is a story about a man who was wrongfully imprisoned for 19 years, walked free with no compensation from the state, and died homeless. This is a story about lost evidence, leaving doubt for some people about who the real killer is. This is a story about a prosecutor who had to erase his own father's legal legacy when deciding not to retry the case. This is a story about a murder victim whose killer may still be out there.
Murders don't happen all that often in Beaver County.
Bruce was a great guy, and he had a tragic, absolutely tragic life. He didn't deserve this.
Do you think Bruce was the killer?
I don't know.
This story begins right here on this piece of land just off of I-15 in central Utah. That's where the body of Sherry Ann Williams was found raped, sodomized, and beaten to death. Investigators quickly identified Bruce Dallas Goodman as the killer, but in a first of its kind here in Utah, Goodman was exonerated with the help of DNA evidence, but not before he spent nearly 20 years behind bars for a murder he did not commit. It was a cold winter morning on November 30th, 1984, when a Utah Department of Transportation road crew made a gruesome discovery. The body of 21-year-old Sherry Ann Foz Williams was found partially nude, her hands and feet bound by rope, dumped along the northbound entrance ramp to Interstate 15 in central Utah.
What happened to Sherry Ann was awful. Absolutely one of the most terrible crimes that I've worked on.
Her body was still warm when peace officers arrived. There was still steam coming off of it, they say. So the killer had just finished his work just perhaps hours before or sooner. The officers that investigated felt it almost felt personal to them. It was just so vicious in the manner of attack.
It was difficult to find people still alive connected to this case. However, I did find Jennifer Springer and Vaughn Christensen, who were on opposite sides of the conviction. Springer worked then and is now the managing attorney for the Rocky Mountain Innocence Center, who helped free Goodman. Christensen is the prosecutor of Beaver County, Utah, where Williams' body was found. He's also the man who had to decide not to retry the case once Goodman's conviction was vacated. Do we know where the murder actually happened, or do we just know that the body was found here in Beaver?
So difficult to determine for sure, but based upon the crime scene, it suggested that an attack had occurred earlier someplace else. There was blood on the back of her sweater that suggested that the assault occurred somewhere else, but that it ended there at the side of the road. The blood spatter evidence suggested that she'd been struck 3 or 4 times on the head right there at the scene, and that's where she died.
In the days that followed, police zeroed in on 32-year-old Bruce Dallas Goodman as the killer. At the time, he was described in local news reports as a Texas drifter with no permanent address. Goodman and Williams had been living together in Las Vegas, Nevada in the months and days leading up to the murder. Goodman was arrested in San Antonio, Texas. He waived extradition and told investigators at the time he was willing to come back to Utah to help them find the killer. Fast forward to 1986, and Goodman stood trial accused of killing Williams. He chose to waive a jury, leaving his fate in the hands of a judge. No murder weapon was ever found, there was no witness to the killing, and the evidence was based on blood type found at the scene and witness testimony in the hours leading up to the murder. At trial, Goodman testified he and Williams had recently broken up, and he admitted to stealing his employer's truck, driving it to California, but prosecutors say the stolen truck was found in Las Vegas the night before the murder.
They were spotted together the night of the murder at midnight at a place called the Union 76 truck stop in Las Vegas, Nevada. They'd been seen quarreling, arguing together.
Goodman testified that November 25th, 1984, 5 days before the body was found, was the last time he saw Williams. She was packing her belongings to hitchhike home to Salt Lake City to reunite with her estranged husband. Also the night before the killing, a separate witness testified to seeing Williams and Goodman arguing at the Peppermill Casino in Mesquite, Nevada, about a 2-hour drive from where the body was found.
So she and the suspect, who had been identified the victims, were traveling together north along I-15 just hours before.
The first woman who was seen at the gas station, she actually does not identify Bruce. She says that Bruce was absolutely not the individual that she saw with Sherry in Las Vegas, and that it was another man and she specifically remembered that because that man had significantly more tattoos than Bruce. He had neck tattoos, was covered.
The witness from the Peppermill Casino picked Goodman out of a photo lineup, but it was later argued the witness was shown a suggestive lineup. 3
of the 6 photos that she was shown in the 6-pack lineup were of Bruce. She had a 50% chance of selecting him. I mean, you simply cannot provide a 6-pack photo lineup with 3 of the photos being the suspect. That's inappropriate.
Prosecutors also introduced one of the few pieces of physical evidence.
There was a cigarette butt found at the scene that had the serology of a type A, I guess, excretor. There was the fluid found inside of her that had the same serology. That combined with the testimonies of the witnesses in both Mesquite and Nevada are what convicted him initially.
That blood type was the same blood type as Goodman in about 32% of men in the U.S. And that was part of his defense, which painted a different picture of events on a different timeline. Multiple witnesses, including Tina and Kenneth Howell, testified that Goodman was 700 miles away in Stockton, California with them on the night of Williams' murder. The rope Williams was found tied up with was determined to not be the same type of rope used at the ranch Goodman had recently worked at. Then there were hair samples found at the scene, determined not to be Goodman's.
This is a fantastic case, and my opinion is that had this evidence been tested in 1984, Bruce would have been excluded as a suspect very early on, and the investigation would have focused on the actual perpetrator who had been identified in those samples.
Judge J. Harlan Burns found Goodman guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced him to 5 years to life in prison.
I don't know what would convince a jury today versus in 1984. What I do know is that today we could do DNA testing on that evidence, and Bruce was excluded. And in my opinion, he would not have been convicted had that evidence been available in 1984 at the time of his trial.
After spending 19 years behind bars, Goodman walked out of prison a free man. Here is a news story from 2004, shortly after he was set free.
Bruce Dallas Goodman says when he set foot outside prison, he couldn't stop smiling.
I've known for the last year that this day was going to get here.
In jail for 20 years, convicted of killing his girlfriend back in the 1980s, DNA technology allowed him to walk out of jail a free man, but not without some bitterness.
It's an emotional roller coaster, and at times I can't help being mad as hell.
Goodman wrote a letter to the Rocky Mountain Innocence Center in Salt Lake. They determined that none of the bodily fluids found at the murder scene belonged to him.
I was not in Utah. I didn't do anything to Sherry Ann Fales. Certainly didn't kill her, certainly didn't rape her.
Now, Goodman will try to relive the last 20 years of his life.
I'm not going to try to live the rest of my life in a couple of weeks. Just take it a step at a time and go from here.
And he can take those steps knowing that his name has been cleared for himself and his family.
It's your scientific proof that your daddy didn't commit this crime.
Also from 2004, Goodman's attorney as he went free.
One of the first comments he said to me was, "See, I told you so." Reasonable doubt does now in fact exist, and had a reasonable trier of fact, jurors at the time, known about this information, it would be very unlikely that he would have been convicted of a murder.
Here's another news report from 2004 with the Attorney General's office.
We don't think it's that clear-cut.
But Utah's Attorney General's office says there's much more to this murder case.
It could mean that more than one person was there at the scene of the murder. It could mean that other people and Goodman were there, and we just didn't pick up any of Goodman's sample.
But the AG's office admits it does create reasonable doubt.
If there's going to be any error here, it's the Attorney General's position that we'd rather err on the side of letting out someone who's guilty than keeping in prison someone who might be innocent.
So how did Goodman walk free? The key was the DNA. After Goodman wrote to them, the Rocky Mountain Innocence Center filed a petition to test swabs and other biological material around the body that had been preserved since the 1984 murder.
Once the DNA evidence was tested, it excluded Bruce from a contributor. It identified another individual as a contributor to those samples.
The Utah Attorney General's office later agreed that DNA evidence was enough to raise reasonable doubt, and Judge J. Philip Eves vacated Goodman's conviction.
Did that show that Bruce could not be placed there at that scene where the body was found?
Correct. Bruce was not placed at the scene where the body was found, and he was not on any of the physical evidence collected from that scene.
Even with that new evidence, the decision was not universally accepted.
To his last day as a police investigator, probably even just dying breath, the lead investigator felt otherwise. Lieutenant Raymond Goodwin was the chief investigator, and he was very confident that they sent the right man to prison.
So in your mind, even as we sit here today, are there still some questions?
There are absolutely still questions. Yes, his conviction was overruled, but only because the DNA found inside the victim didn't match his. There was still other evidence pointing to him. The fact that the conviction was reversed and that he was exonerated doesn't necessarily mean innocence, but what it does mean is reasonable doubt.
Does the thought ever cross a prosecutor's mind of the person on the other side of the table, and if you are sending the right person to prison for the rest of their life?
Well, that's something that I absolutely have to weigh. I have to see that justice is done. And justice being doesn't necessarily mean that anybody is punished just to satisfy, somebody's anger. It means that we get the right person.
Today, more than 40 years after the murder, no one else has been charged with killing Williams. Back in 2004, Goodman walked free, and as prosecutor, Vaughn Christensen had to decide if he was going to retry the case.
The court gave me 5 days to make a charging decision. After it reversed Goodman's conviction, I had a 5-day deadline to track down witnesses, to evaluate the strength of the case. To see what kind of a case I could put together. 5 days wasn't nearly enough time after 19 years.
Christensen was elected to the Beaver County Attorney's Office in 2002, so when the conviction was overturned, he had been on the job for less than 2 years.
That was the only exoneration I've ever encountered as a prosecutor, and I don't know what's normal, but it didn't feel normal to me. It felt really rushed and really pushed, especially after the case had been in the works for so long. Now, here's the reason why I wasn't able to retry it. The results came back showing that it was not Bruce Dallas Goodman's DNA that was found inside of her. It was somebody else, or possibly more than one other person. Goodwin felt that perhaps that raised reasonable doubt, but on the other hand, it could potentially have explained a basis for the killing. If Goodman was angry that somebody else had been with her, that could potentially be a motive for her killing.
There was a second reason, a big reason, why Christensen says he couldn't retry the case.
There was some missing evidence 20 years after the case had been initially tried. That cigarette butt that had been put into the snow right next to her body was missing.
Christensen says after the trial, all of the evidence, including the cigarette butt, was in the court's custody for several years. The evidence was then moved to a newly opened court facility and then back to the sheriff's office before being tested. I asked and learned that today, the records no longer exist.
They insisted that they gave the sheriff everything, but the sheriff said we never got the cigarette butt. So somehow, somewhere, that cigarette butt was lost, and it was never tested. And so the DNA on that cigarette butt is still unknown. And he may very well have been there at the scene. We just don't know. I didn't refile the charges because at that point there was reasonable doubt. Without a substantial likelihood of success at trial, I couldn't go forward.
Was there ever any pressure for you to go ahead and retry the case even without the cigarette butt?
Well, of course. You can imagine that this would be deeply disappointing to the victim's family.
Yeah.
And it would be deeply disappointing to Lieutenant Goodwin. He and I had some long conversations about this. But ultimately, I couldn't move forward because the DNA raised reasonable doubt.
Right.
And it had been 19 years. We couldn't find those witnesses in Mesquite and in Las Vegas. They were gone.
So DNA aside, if you did find the witnesses and if you did have that cigarette butt, what is the likelihood that you think you would have refiled?
It would have been much higher. Right. I mean, obviously, after 19, 20 years, the witnesses' memories would have been unclear. Mm-hmm. So I would have had to have evaluated, how good their memories were, how clear their memories were. Mm-hmm. That would have played a factor in it.
But the fact is, without the cigarette butt, nothing could prove Goodman was at the scene of the murder. The original prosecutor in this case was the Beaver County attorney at the time, Vaughn Christensen's father. So when it was Vaughn's decision to not retry the case, he says he essentially undid one of the biggest cases his father ever tried.
You kind of alluded to it, that you had some long conversations, some tough conversations. For you personally, how difficult is a decision to not retry, especially a murder case?
Well, in a case as important as this, you want to make sure you get it right. And I have a very high burden of proof as a prosecutor. I have to ultimately prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a person's guilty. And with the new DNA evidence, I couldn't meet that threshold. And so ultimately, despite all the pressure to prosecute, I couldn't go forward with the reasonable doubt intact.
Is there a little bit of unknown for you?
Well, there's certainly, for me personally, a lot of unknown. I don't know what the odds are that maybe someday some DNA will be found that matches that found inside of our victim. I'd welcome that day.
Christensen also remembers the difficult talk he had with the victim's family after deciding not to retry the case.
It was deeply upsetting to them because they, I would say even to this day, remain firmly convinced that he was the killer, as was Lieutenant Goodwin. And so my decision not to re-prosecute was deeply hurtful to them. It was really difficult.
DNA can put someone at a crime scene and can solve mysteries.
In this case, because of the unique circumstances and because of the lost evidence, it didn't necessarily solve the mystery. If it wasn't Goodman, well then who? Who was it? Because all of the other indicators, all the other evidence pointed to him.
The prosecutor also talked to me about the missing cigarette butt. The prosecutor told me that without being able to test that, he can't definitively say that Bruce is innocent. What do you say to that?
I'm disappointed to hear that, and I believe that the evidence that was tested in the biological material immediately surrounding the victim's body and in the vaginal swabs conclusively shows that Bruce was innocent of this crime.
What's taking place now is justice. What took place before was the law taking its course.
That is what Bruce Goodman's state of mind was during an interview shortly after being set free.
I had somebody explain it to me as being the most horrendous human rights violation can take place in this country. To have a man lose his freedom for no reason whatsoever. I'm not going to try to live the rest of my life in a couple of weeks. Just take it a step at a time and go from here.
What happened to Bruce after he was exonerated and set free?
Unfortunately, after Bruce was released from prison in 2004, he had a tough life. He was homeless, kind of bouncing around.
Years after Goodman's release, Springer was a law student working with the Rocky Mountain Innocence Center and tasked with finding and bringing him back to Utah. Springer needed to find Goodman to petition the court for his factual innocence and compensation for being wrongfully imprisoned.
How the heck did you find a homeless person in another state?
You know, it's funny, that's just what we do. I mean, if you think about it, we're investigating cases from 2 decades ago, sometimes 3 decades ago, and what we're doing is we're looking for old witnesses, and sometimes they're unhoused. So we're pretty creative around here and pretty resilient.
What was it like to locate him?
I very clearly remember when I found Bruce. He was actually just hanging out under a tree in a park, just laying there. And I was looking for him. I was there with some other folks trying to track him down. And I just walked up to him and I was like, I recognized him, hey, are you Bruce? And sure enough, it was. And so we continued to kind of stay in touch when he was here. It was really great. He was staying in a hotel while we were kind of working through some of the litigation.
When you found him and you had to locate him, what were his spirits like then?
I didn't know Bruce for a long time because unfortunately he passed away shortly after he got back to Utah. Mm-hmm. But Bruce was a great guy and he had a tragic, absolutely tragic life. He didn't deserve this, losing 18 years of your life to be incarcerated for a crime that you didn't commit is awful. He lost time developing a career or spending time with his kids. Who knows what Bruce's life would have looked like had this not happened to him.
In 2004, when Goodman's conviction was overturned, there was no law to compensate the wrongfully convicted. But by the time Springer got on the case, a law had been passed, which is why she needed to find him.
From a legal perspective, when Bruce was exonerated, was he officially declared innocent?
He was in 2015.
Okay.
When he was originally released from prison in 2004, there was no factual innocence statute or compensation law on the books.
Okay.
So he was just released from prison.
Goodman died of a heart attack in 2014, and it wasn't until the next year that a judge ordered his declaration of innocence. So Goodman died never seeing a dime for his wrongful imprisonment. Goodman's 3 children eventually received a total of $100,000 to share between them.
Is that what a life is worth?
No. I mean, no amount of money is going to give Bruce back 18 years of incarceration, right? You never get those holidays back with your kids. You never get those life experiences.
Looking back on it, did the state fail Bruce?
The criminal justice system is made up of people, and people make mistakes. And I think what is the most important thing to do is that when we are aware that we made an error, we need to fix it to the best of our ability. And I don't think that happened here. You know, I think it took too long for Bruce. And, you know, it's absolutely tragic and heartbreaking that he passed away before he got his name truly cleared. You know, I wish I would have got to spend some more time with him and got to really give him the good news of his formal declaration of innocence. And I wish that things had turned out a little differently in that. It's just tragic.
Did he have resentment for the system?
You know, I can't speak to that.
He never really said anything like that to you or showed that in any way
No,
towards you?
I didn't get a sense from him. No, what I would say is, you know, he was dealt a really tough hand. And I think he did the best that he could with the tools that he was given and the experience that he had gone through.
What is someone's legacy after they're exonerated and you kind of see the rest of their life play out? What do you think Bruce's legacy is?
Oof. You know, what I think that for Bruce, the most important thing for him, my guess, is that he wanted to have his name cleared, right? And I think that we as an organization are very proud and we feel very privileged that we were able to do that. Even though he didn't get to see it, we were able to get that posthumous declaration of innocence. And I think that would have been really important to Bruce.
There's still a victim out there that doesn't have justice. What do we make of that in this case?
You know, what happened to Sherry Ann was awful. Absolutely one of the most terrible crimes that I've worked on. And what I would say is she didn't get justice, and that there's DNA evidence available where efforts could be made to identify the actual perpetrator.
Is this case still considered cold? There's not been a suspect identified since Bruce's passing, correct?
Correct, and part of the reason for that is Lieutenant Goodman was just so certain that the right person had been convicted.
Are you convinced today that he is the killer?
Well, my problem is I don't know, right? And if the prosecutor doesn't know, then how can the case move forward? The reasonable doubt really created problems with moving the case forward.
Based on what you know, based on everything that's happened, is Bruce innocent?
There is no doubt in my mind that Bruce is innocent. He did not commit this crime, and the evidence shows it.
Posthumous declarations of innocence, like what Goodman received, are extremely rare. In the eye of the court, Goodman did not kill Williams. But as we've shown, some people still aren't entirely convinced he was innocent. So here are the questions still to answer. Is Sherry Ann Williams' killer alive? And if so, will they ever be found? I'm Jim Spiewak. Thank you for watching this YouTube original.